been wanting to make some box joints for a while, and I finally decided to make a jig. I saw Bourbon Moth do it, and it seemed like a pretty good design, so I followed his lead. This is very similar, just with a couple tweaks that we'll look at in the video, and it turns out makes pretty great box joints. So let's get into it. So first step is to cut the width of the runners that are going to sit in the grooves on your table saw. You're going to use hardwood for this. It slides really well. I've used the dense hard plastic before, and when I screwed through it, even when I did a countersink, when those screws went in, it made it pooch out a little bit, and it became really tight in these runner areas. So once you've got them cut to width, you're going to cut them to depth. You want your runners to be just slightly proud of the base of the table saw, because when you're pushing this sled, you don't want it bottoming out. You want only the runners to be really what's touching the table and bearing the brunt of the weight of the sled. So for the width of the box, it needs to be long enough so that the runners provide stabilization, but it needs to be short enough so that when you get to that point, when the back of the box is sitting at the apex of the blade and you've made your box joint cut, the whole sled is not going to tip over the back. So I cut it, looks about like 4 inches shorter than the width of my table saw. With your runners done, it's time to move on to the box. I'm using 3/4 inch plywood finished on both sides because it slides easier on the table saw and it's a little bit smoother. When it's just me cutting by myself, I just have to put a little clamp on the back so it doesn't fall out and hold it. So now we're cutting to the width, and now you're cutting the surround box. So this is the part that you're going to be holding as you push the sled. You don't want it so high that the sled is just a behemoth to push through, but you don't want it super low because then your fingers are going to be a little closer to the blade. So I think I went with about 5.5, 6 inches or so. Bring your runners flush with the back of the table saw. Go ahead and protect your table because we're going to be using CA glue and accelerator. Then you're going to find your center and mark accordingly and mark where your runners are going to sit. Your fence is going to come over and square the whole thing up. So glue goes on the little runners, and then the accelerator is going to go on your board, which is why I marked it beforehand. The fence is already set, so as long as it's square and you butt it up there and then have it flush towards the back, you should be all completely squared up. Then apply a little pressure. If you feel like that's not enough, then go grab a stool and really put some pressure on it until I feel good about it, which is right there. Now, CA glue and accelerator is not your permanent fix. It is your placeholder so that you can affix the objects correctly permanently, either with screws or brads or nails or whatever. So here's where I neglected to show permanently affixing those runners to the base. I did countersink holes. I think I did 3 on each side, which was probably a little bit overkill. And then pre-drilled, I used 1-inch screws, and I made it so that the head sat below flush on the runners. So when you're moving it through the table saw, no metal is in contact with any of the table saw. With the base all put together, now we're just building the frame, but we're just building 3 sides, not the back, because the back is going to be removable and affixed with screws. So this is just a glue and tacking together. Again, the height is kind of whatever you want it to be. I chose, I think, 5.5 inches. So because your base is completely square, this will naturally square up the whole jig. So as you nail on the bottom, just remember that you're going to have the blade of the saw running through the middle of that sled in between the 2 runners. So no metal anywhere near that blade. So the width of your blade is going to be the width of your box joints. I'm doing a 1/2 inch box joint, so I'm going to use a 1/2 inch dado stack. So there's a little chart on your dado kit that'll say how many blades you need, how many chippers you need. So you just put them back in, keeping your fingers out of the way, and now you're ready. So now you've got the back of the jig. Going to scooch over to the right, so you've got 1.5 inches or 2 extra, and you're going to fix it temporarily with a couple clamps. No glue, no screw.
This is because I want to be able to replace it with a different jig to do like a 1/4 inch box joint. Once that's all set, you're going to turn your saw on and slowly bring up that blade right in the middle and then go through the back. Now the height of the exposed blade needs to be a hair higher than the width of the material that you're using. So this is a piece of scrap of the material that I'm going to be using for my boxes. You need to make a little tongue that's the exact width of that groove or that notch that we just cut in the sled. So I cut 3 or 4 different, tiny little different tongues because I knew I needed to get close. So you try each one. I've got 3 or 4 different ones. They're off by maybe 1/4 of a millimeter a piece or something. So it needs to fit snug in that notch, but not super snug. You can sand it a little bit, but remember you want the thing to stay nice and square. So I tried a couple. Once you get the exact width and thickness, I cut it in half so I had 2. You'll see why in a second. So now you're going to take that perfect little tongue and glue it in place into that groove so that when it's on the sled, it's facing towards the blade. Nice and flush, nice and square. Wipe your glue away. So with the back still mobile, and you've got your little extra tongue, move the back over a little bit more. So it's exactly twice as far away from the blade. And then keep hold of that little tongue and hold on to it for future use, for if you need to for when you put the back on again. Now, it's perfectly set right here. Take your clamps, throw them on, and this is where you're going to go through the whole jig now because it's all squared and stable. So you've got the back panel where you want it. If this was going to be a permanent thing, this is where you would just glue and tack. I'm just using screws, again, because I want to be able to replace the back panel with a 1/4 inch jig to be able to do 1/4 inch box joints on the same sled instead of having to build a different one. When you are screwing, remember that your blade is going to be going through that middle cut that you did, so don't put any screws near there. I think I put 2 on each side and then 2 going from the back to the front. And now your jig is set and it's time to start some test pieces. So I used 5/8 inch plywood just because I was fooling around and seeing how it would work. So you want to hold it snugly against the back and snugly against that first little tongue. If you find that on the first pass, the blade is kind of grabbing it and trying to move it, you can throw a clamp on your right side or clamp a piece of wood on the right side and it will hold it a lot more stable. If the tongue is way too tight, hit it with a bit of 220 grit until it just fits snugly on the piece that you're running through the saw.
So the 1/2 inch box joints turned out pretty fantastic. Super tight, glued up well, didn't take too much time to sand down, proud just enough, and just smooth, like really smooth. Tight corners, no gaps. I am very pleased. Hope you enjoy yours. So, I made a finger joint sled. It took about 3.5 hours. I used 15 millimeter Baltic birch, which was $86 for a sheet. And then I used 3/4 inch shop grade plywood with one side finished. I think it was maple, and it was about $54. I'm really pleased that I decided to screw the back on. I'll be able to take it off and hopefully make a new one for a different size finger joint. I want to try a 1/4 inch and 1/8 of an inch. It also made it nice to be able to take it off and fine tune the little tooth. So the 2 major kind of hang-ups were the tooth at first was too snug. And so when I went to put the box together, the joints were super, super tight. There's no way glue could fit in, and it was just too tight. So I had to take the back off, take out this little tooth, and just sand it down on 120 grit for a little bit, just with my hand, both sides. And then I eventually got, after doing that a couple times, I got it spot on. So at this point, they fit about like that. Not too loose, not too tight, and with some glue in there, it will be perfect. The first time I ran it through as well, the teeth were a little bit shallow. So I ended up raising the blade just about a quarter turn or an eighth of a turn. I ended up doing that twice just to make them a little deeper, because that way they'll be proud and I'll be able to sand them down. They fit really, really nicely, really, really smooth. There was some blowout on the back side, so I'll be working on that. But I hope you enjoyed, and go make something cool.